originally from Pennsylvania. I have a degree in environmental education, marine science, so I moved from Pittsburgh to the Keys in the 70s. And that's when I knew I wasn't going back. And started to realize, once I started moving around to different parks, hey, there's a lot of history in Florida that you don't learn when you're going to school in Pennsylvania. So moved around different places, ended up in Fort Lauderdale, and right up the road a little ways was Florida Atlantic University. So I ended up getting a degree in American history from FAU. Go Owls! Nittany Lions on one side and the Owls on the other side. So really have a love for Florida history, and there's just so much here that, as I said, you don't learn. It depends who's writing the history books. So the Spanish in particular is completely eliminated from any history that you learn. I remember going to the Smithsonian years ago, not all that many years ago, maybe in the 90s, and walking through whatever the history building is and seeing first settlers or first people in Florida. And I'm thinking, oh, I'm going to learn about the Spanish. Who do you think was there? It was the British. It was Roanoke and Plymouth Rock. That area, the Mayflower. But thank you very much for coming. I think we'll go ahead and get started. While I'm thinking about it, we're going to be talking just briefly about pottery. When we're discussing the native people who lived in the area now. So I'm going to pass this piece around, and I'm not an archaeologist, not an anthropologist, and I didn't even stay at a Holiday Inn Express. So I have my own idea of what this was, where this came from. So I just pass it around, and at the end, somebody remind me that it's out there, and then I'll have everybody guess, and I'll tell you what I think.
Got a few more walking up. Don't mind waiting one more walk. And then we'll get started for Bill.
All right.
It's not heavy.
No, not heavy. History from 6,000 years ago, that's just what is known. So the history probably goes back way before that, until 1982 when it became a state park. So, cool shot probably from the drone. So water coming out of the ground, out of a hole in the ground, has attracted people for all of these years for various reasons. So it's incredible that just having water there, and there would be water anywhere from St. John's, but just the fact it's coming up out of the ground has attracted people for all of these years. You can see the, I got a pointer here. As you can probably tell, that's the deepest area. It goes down to about 25 feet. So that's a cone shape. And the vent isn't very big. It's only about 4 feet diameter. And if you can picture a popcorn popper, and that's what it looks like from all the shells that just keep being blown up over and over. So it's too narrow for divers. They don't allow diving into the cave. So no cave diving. That's the part.
Brian, what are the dimensions?
About 150 feet by 160 feet.
Okay.
It's cold.
Temperature.
It's cold.
72 degrees, which isn't the coldest that the springs get. As you move north, they get colder. So the ones across the northern part of the state are down to about 68 degrees. So this is what the Earth looked like during the last ice age. This is all ice, so it tied up a lot of the ocean water, and you can see these misshapen continents here. That's because sea level dropped about 400 feet. Hope they won't go that far yet. And you can see Florida, how wide it was there. Florida would have been, what was like that land? Florida was about 300 miles wide. It's about twice the width that it is today. So how did people get to the Western Hemisphere? For the longest time, it was thought everybody came across the Bering Strait and then spread down through the Americas, down all the way down to the tip of South America. But come to find through a lot of research that in South America there are sites that might be 30,000 years old. So everybody's rethinking this, and possibly people have come from Polynesia from the South Pacific came over this way. During the Ice Age, came right along the edge of the ice. There are sites that are 20,000 years old there. And of course, the people came down through the Bering Strait, and then people followed the coastline. Coast hugging just came down along here and settled along the way. So many different ways that people probably came into the Western Hemisphere. And in Florida, there's a site on the Civil River outside of Tallahassee that's probably at least, they're saying 15,000 years ago, maybe even longer, the people were in that area. So here's the drawing of Florida showing what it looked like. The Paleo-Indian shoreline shows pre about 12,000 years ago. So a lot of the sites from the first people here are underwater. So they're trying to figure out how to do, with better technology, doing underwater excavating. And then there's North America showing the shoreline. So just to give you a little background. And everything was supersized then. Mammoths, sloths, 2,000-pound bears, armadillos the size of Volkswagen, giant sloths. So the first people, they had long spears with huge spear points on them that were several inches long that they used for harvesting these larger animals that weren't very fast, especially the mammoth and the mastodons. When the Europeans first depicted native people, they thought they were 7 to 8 feet tall. They gave them European features because they really didn't have a point of reference. This was a French artist who came over when the French were trying to come into Florida and up around the area that's now Jacksonville. But come to find out that they had some of it right, as we'll see, but they sort of meet these fanciful drawings that people have. But, you know, they were just like us. And just like some of the first settlers, some of the first Europeans, they were just people trying to raise a family, trying to have shelter, trying to have enough food. So they were just people, and they were using the technology and doing the best that they could. The waterways were the highways, so there were dugout canoes, the first means of transportation, and used those to get around. And of course, the DeLeon Spring could go into the St. John's and all the way up to the ocean and back far south, almost to Brevard County. And as animals got smaller, and it's amazing how these inventions seem to just pop up worldwide, went from spears, as animals got smaller, as the climate warmed up, the bow and arrow was developed. The deer is really the primary animal that they use for tools and for clothing and anything else that they need. We find turtle shell bones and some alligator parts, but as far as the animal that's most used for tools and things that they needed, that would have been the deer. So the projectile points went from the larger points, and as the animals got smaller, they needed to be able to stalk the deer with a bow and arrow, and then they got to be that size, just maybe a couple of inches long, meaning more what you think of when you hear the term arrowhead. Those are your typical arrowheads. And they used all the technology available to them to make what they needed to survive and really thrive in Florida and all across North America. These are tools made out of deer bones, and we have some of these at the park. I think that might be part of a deer scapula, but when you hold it, it gives me goosebumps because it fits perfectly in your hand. Your forefinger wraps right around there, your thumb on top, so that was probably an awl or maybe AWL for making holes in something. And this one, we have one of those. Your thumb fits right there, and you can manipulate it with your hand. And say that with these, you just grab it like that, and then twist and push and do whatever you need to do. And then a lot of these were found, these were probably fishing net needles. The ones that are more decorative would have been hairpins. So the pottery is going around. We talked a little bit about pottery. The first pottery wasn't fired. It was very plain. That's back when Indians still had to spend a lot of their time and energy gathering food, so they had enough food to eat. It wasn't until they became more established and started growing crops, they had a little more time to sit around and decorate their pottery. So went from that to pottery was more decorative. And some of the decoration was incised, where they just had a little sharp tool, and some of it they made like the check stamp. They would get a piece of flat wood and just carve the checks in that, and then press that against the clay to make the decorative look. Tick Island, which is several miles north of the park, that's like a whole nother level of technology and advanced society with the Tabuquans. The Tabuquans extended from around Lake George all the way to what's now Georgia, all the southeast over to the east coast. And if you look at, and this could be a whole other program here, if you just looked at that and I said, where do you think this came from? Probably the majority would say, oh, that looks like Mayan, like Central South America, which could be some of that technology was imported as people moved back and forth. And the trading that went on was more like a relay. You didn't trade. If you wanted metal from the upper Midwest, well, you didn't send somebody up there. You went so far and you traded whelk shells to get something, and then they went a little, they would go a little further, and then the metal would make its way back down. So these are all carved from bone found and shell found at Tick Island. The Tamuquans were described as being tall, not 7 feet tall, but tall. They had a lot of tattoos, ornamental things. Had a top knot that tied their hair up on the top of their head. And until really the 1980s, it was thought that all of the native people down through where DeLeon Springs is, Pontoon Island, down to the lake down around Enterprise, were Tamuquans. So with research being done, people going to the Spanish archives in Seville come to find out this was a completely different group of people. And the Spanish called them the Mayaca. A lot of small groups, the Jujoro, the Cuera, some that you really don't hear about, Ais. They were hunter-gatherers. In fact, the Spanish weren't impressed when they started their missions and doing their mission work. After they came across the top of Florida, the north part of Florida from the east to the west, they started filtering down into the peninsula. And thought the Mayaca were lazy because they had seen the Tamuquan and how their society was more at an advanced level. Like I said, they grew crops. And the Mayaca, they're still hunters and gatherers, and they just weren't impressed with them. I found this one photo that could be the mound. The house that sits up on the mound, that's the park manager's residence. So that's the main mound there at the park, as far as we know. So we know there's a burial mound, there's a midden, all the shells, and there could have been a ceremonial mound. So this possibly is the mound before it was cleared. And a lot of that mound is snails, a lot of the middens that run along, there are middens that run along on the north side and on the south side, and other parts of the park as you go down the spring run. So those middens are the snails that they carry, that they gather. Tons and tons of snails, so that was a big part of their diet. So you just hear kids going, what's for dinner? Oh no, not snails. Snails again, Mom. Well, if you go out there and hunt something like we told you, then we'll have more than just snails. In the mid-90s, archaeologists were hired to determine, it was first to determine just what where the edge of the mound was. There's the house sitting up there, the spring is down here, so the edge of the mound is down there. The first pit that they dug, not even 3 feet deep, they found intact burials that went back 6,000 years, including a child. So then they knew that this was an important burial area. So they called in some native people, and they did a reinterment ceremony and stopped the digging there. So the work that they did right here, that pit that first test pit that they dug was right here. And just as a disclaimer, I make sure I point out, the state did not build a house on the top of a burial mound. That was done by the previous owner, which was a private recreational park back in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s. George Topher was the individual who owned the property. He built the house here, dug out on the backside for a 2-car garage, and talking to a couple of the local guys who were around and were teenagers said they remember at least 15 skeletons that were dug out. So I could do a whole program on the paranormal
Yeah.
in the house. This is something that really should get more news and be more well known. There's not the two oldest canoes found in the Western Hemisphere were found in the park in 1985 and 1990. They were found by divers in the spring. They were brought up, sent to Tallahassee for conservation, and just because it was that real spongy wood, like if you pulled out a piece of wood, like a piece of tree root that's been underwater, it's kind of spongy, and it just started to deteriorate, and they ended up with just pieces. So the canoes were 5,000 years old. One is 5,000, one is 6,000 years old. So as I said, I had been at the park since 2005. It wasn't until about 2017 I started thinking about those canoes again and thought, well, I wonder if there's anything left, because all I heard was they deteriorated. So I contacted the Florida Department of State and their collection area. They said, oh yeah, we have a lot of pieces, some of them 3 and 4 feet long. So if one of the rangers go up and bring the pieces back, and it was still kind of spongy. So I did my own conservation work. I got exterior almost glue and mixed it with water and just painted several coats on there to make it hardened pieces. So we have these on display in the visitor center at the park. Another burial mound was found by C.B. Moore. He was an archaeologist, came down in the late 1800s. And just give you some reference here. There's where the park's located now, where he wrote in DeLeon. And he said 3/4 of a mile north of the spring, he found a burial. It was a single burial. It was 145 feet across, all made of sand and 4 feet high. And so I'm thinking of somebody important, and maybe they found it because there was a path going back and forth. No artifacts associated with it, and it's never been found since. In 2011, the University of South Florida did some survey using LiDAR, where they fly over it and use this radar that can determine what the, really give you an idea what the topography is under all the vegetation, and found a couple of hot spots right in the area where C.B. Moore said it would be located. But that's been agricultural fields, it's been, somebody said a sod farm, it was logged, all the pines were logged out by the 1940s. And if you figure a 4-foot high sand mound that tapers down wouldn't last very long. Just rain and erosion might have worn it away. So it's interesting that we know there is another burial on park property. So I always like to, being a historian, give some context, so we're not just looking at things kind of under, just in one little spot. What was going on in Florida worldwide, and how some of the things in Florida influence national events and international and vice versa. Yeah, I'm sorry, but this thing's real touchy. They have problems with their remote, so I'm doing this just by running my thumb over the little wheel. So the Spanish were here from 1513 to 1763, and the British from 1763 to 1783. When the Spanish came back in 1783 until 1821, it became U.S. territory, and then statehood was March 3rd, 1845. Florida became the 27th state. So the Spanish, this is something interesting. When I thought, well, how long were the Spanish in Florida? Not until the tricentennial will the United States have been a country longer than Spain had Florida. So when's the tricentennial? What year would that be? This is a quick quiz. 2076. Very good. Juan Ponce de Leon. He arrived in April 1513 and named it La Florida, to the Feast of Flowers. So this is always my opportunity to talk about Ponce, and people think that Ponce was at DeLeon Springs. Fake history, which we'll see in a minute. So this is what an artist's depiction of the arrival of the Spanish in the Americas looked like, and I thought this was kind of funny. Look, they're all scared. Look how wide-eyed they are. It shows the Indians, they're sneaking up behind them. there's something going on there, but I'm sure it didn't look like that, but that's another one of those interesting, fanciful depictions.
It's because the Indian women didn't wear tops.
Oh, right. It worked out. So there was a map from 1511 that showed Florida is just this squiggly line up there. So you can recognize Cuba, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico. So you think about Ponce de Leon, the Spanish explorer. So he started over here in Spain, is what you would think. And he comes across and he runs into Florida. Well, he was already over here. He was the governor of Puerto Rico. And he got tired of being governor, and I heard that Columbus's son, there was a run-in with him, and he wanted to be governor. So Ponce goes to the king and says, how about if I go up to Florida, see if I can find gold? So he says, fine, claim whatever you want for yourself and for Spain, and then we'll work out any gold that you might find. But of course, there was no gold. So that's what he did. So his trip was from Puerto Rico up to Florida. And this is a map that is supposed to be one of his maps. For some reason, the writing on it is upside down, but here's South Florida, there's the 10,000 islands, there are the Keys, and guess where it stops? Up around Brevard County. So that's where it stopped and he landed, which makes sense. He's riding on the west side of the Gulf Stream, taking advantage of that 3 or 4 mile an hour current. He would probably have come within sight of land where that part of Florida projects out into the ocean. So to me, that makes sense. You know, other people jumped on the Ponce thing to get tourists to come, especially St. Augustine. Let me see that. Actually, the next one. Yeah. Oh, that 1521 trip, not so good. That's when he went back up and decided to try to establish a colony in southwest Florida and runs into the Calusa, who liked him even less than the other Indians liked him. And he ended up getting shot in the thigh and then died in Cuba in 1521. He wasn't that old. He was about 42 in his first trip. So I guess they're getting up in his 50s. That was getting up to be pretty old back then, but he didn't survive that. This shows the missions, as they first came across North Florida, as I said, and then came down through Central Florida. And the Spanish kept meticulous records. So once these records were found, it was determined that the Mayaca were a separate group from the Telucans. By the mid-1700s, though, most of the native people in Florida were gone. Nobody knows how many. It could have been in the hundreds of thousands, but because of first Spanish enslavement, introduction of diseases, warfare, some of them who were alive saying, we're getting the heck out of here, and they go somewhere else. The population was just about wiped out. And this is interesting. I like old maps, so I'm looking at this 1827 map. Lake Okeechobee was called Lake Mayaca. So I'm thinking, well, why is it called Lake Mayaca? Well, maybe they did like the Seminoles did in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. They ran off to the swamps in South Florida where they could escape the United States government. So it's possible that some of the Mayaca people ended up in that area. So this is something that I just put in a couple of days ago. I was thinking about this activity that I used to do with kids groups, and the reason I use a school bus as a reference is because it's kids. It involves a long string, so I guess 40 feet would be maybe about the length of this room here. And they stretch out a string, and we have 3x5 cards that have different points in history, and from prehistory up through Columbus and everything, from Columbus forward. So I thought, well, that's a good reference to show how long people have been here. So if you have a 40-foot school bus, the Europeans have been here for that much. The native people were here for 39 feet. So the people were here for thousands and thousands of years. And the only thing that they left behind were the artifacts and then any information that we get from the Spanish. So the archaeological work that's done is so important in learning about the people who came before us. And just to give a little bit of reminder about the Seminoles. Remember, they weren't the original people. They were being pushed out by settlers moving west. So they were the Creeks and Muskogees who then decided to come into Florida. They filled the void where the original people were. So they didn't come into Florida until starting in the 1700s. And they had with them runaway slaves from plantations who who then assimilated with the Indians, and then they moved down and further into the peninsula until they were pushed down into South Florida. And now they're getting their revenge with casinos. So Osceola and Micanopy are a couple of things that you hear. Osceola, the self-proclaimed chief, not the official chief, and then Micanopy was the chief of the Seminoles. And you know where he lived? Because there's down in Micanopy. As I said, the British were in Florida from 1763 to 1783. They divided Florida into East and West Florida. So something you never learned. How many of you learned history up north somewhere? Unfortunately, me too, being in Pennsylvania. Learned about 13 original colonies. Well, there were 15. There was East Florida and West Florida, and they both remained more loyal to the British during the American Revolution. But you hear nothing about that. Here's the new and accurate map of East and West Florida drawn from the best authorities. But it shows you how this area was pretty well known because it was being settled and people had been here since the Spanish. But down here, especially the interior, is pretty much guesswork. Okay, now we're zeroing back. I know what you're thinking. Is this the program I came for? Now we're zeroing back into DeLeon Springs, and some of this will tie in.